Last time, the sister of Mary Ellen Diener, the 14-year-old murdered by Lester Eubanks, made an impassioned plea to his family and to anyone who might have seen him over the years.
She is no longer with us in the physical sense, but as long as her convicted murderer is free, her soul cannot be at rest.
And a friend of Lester's father may have had an important clue to Lester's whereabouts on his living room wall.
Holy smoke, they just got the painting. Think it'll yield anything?
I'm Sunny Hostin from ABC News. This is Have You Seen This Man? Any search as old as the one for Lester Eubanks will almost certainly be hampered by faded memories, missing evidence, and key figures who have passed away. All of those factors have applied as the U.S. Marshals scoured the country for signs of Lester. But investigators do have some advantages in cases this old. Would modern forensics pick up clues that Lester couldn't have known he was leaving behind? Here's ABC News senior investigative reporter Matthew Mosk.
There's a dusty box pulled from the evidence lockers at the police headquarters in Mansfield, Ohio, and in it sits the .32 caliber revolver that Lester Eubanks used to shoot Mary Ellen Diener on a pitch-black night in 1965. There's the brick he used to crush her skull, still stained with her blood, and the clothes taken from her lifeless body. I was with Dawn Fryback, the forensic scientist for the Mansfield Police Department, in a noisy basement lab at police headquarters. She first began searching through the old evidence in 2016, looking for traces of Lester Eubanks' genetic material.
With old cases, it can be a little trickier because 50 years ago, the evidence was handled differently than what we would handle evidence nowadays.
Back then, police didn't wear gloves at the crime scene. Evidence may not have been bagged and sealed properly.
These are court exhibits, so jurors could have handled them, bailiffs, prosecutors, defense attorneys. So a lot of these items had been handled, but some of the items did have blood on them, so hopefully those items would have been handled with gloves.
As the hunt for Lester heated back up, Frybeck recognized the potential value of DNA to this search. More than once, Lester had been accused of trying to force himself on women in the 1960s. So there's reason to wonder if this criminal behavior may have continued after his escape. And if it did, samples of his genetic material may very well be sitting in a police evidence locker somewhere, just waiting for a match.
If we're able to generate Lester's DNA profile, then we'll be able to put it in the database and see if it hits any other samples from multiple crimes across the country.
But trying to pull DNA from evidence that was decades old, that was no easy task. As Frybeck looked through the surviving evidence, she weighed her options. There was no sign of Lester's blood or semen on the clothing that remained. Any skin cells on the brick would have long since dried up. She found hair samples, but none with the roots, which are packed with DNA, that she would need.
There was some clothing from Lester Eubanks. So his military clothing, hat, boots, I believe, general fatigue type clothing. So I went ahead and I tested the hat.
I asked her, what was it about the hat that jumped out at her?
Well, hats are typically a type of item that we're going to get a DNA profile from. Again, talking about nowadays standards. So a hat is, usually worn for an extended amount of time. If you're sweating, some of those, the sweat might help pull some of those skin cells off of your forehead and transfer to the hat.
Frybeck swabbed the brim of the hat and gathered what she hoped would be usable DNA. The results emerged on a paper printout that looked like a chart or a graph.
I say it looks a lot like an echocardiogram or, if somebody's had like a contraction monitor on their belly while they're pregnant to watch those contractions. It's an instrument signal, so it's kind of chugging along at a baseline level. And then when that instrument detects a piece of DNA that we've labeled with fluorescent markers, it actually indicates a signal and will show a peak. And from that, we look at the instrument and look at those peaks, and then we end up printing it out, usually for our case file.
I asked her if Lester's printout showed any sign of DNA, anything even close.
No, flatline, nothing.
Investigators were undeterred, and Dawn started thinking about other ways to find Lester's DNA. As police officials packed up the evidence of Lester's crime, it was hard not to be moved. The gun, the brick, and that fistful of dull nickels, the ones Mary Ellen was planning to use at the laundry and was still clutching when she died. It all harkened back to 1965. In the thick of this manhunt, it could be easy to see it all in clinical terms and forget what has driven this effort from the start. On one of my first trips to Mansfield, Ohio, my colleague Cindy Galley and I stopped at the Mansfield Cemetery to pay proper respect to the teenage victim, Mary Ellen Diener.
The destination is on your left. Mansfield Cemetery Association Incorporated.
The cemetery covers more than 70 acres, with thousands of markers, some dating back centuries. Using a map with Mary Ellen's burial location, we set out. The grounds were divided into grids. We were looking for section H5.
We're going to pass the mausoleum. That's that thing, I think. Mm-hmm. And then as we approach...
It's over there. It's going to be, right?
Yeah, as we approach H5...
We tried to follow the landmarks on the map.
Okay. As we approach H5, we're going to see a large black marker.
But as hard as we searched, we saw no gravestone for Mary Ellen. We were baffled. We asked Pam Bouts, a cemetery manager, and she came out to look for herself. No marker had ever been placed there.
She did not have a stone there at all. And just got to thinking, I guess, for 40-something years, she's laid unmarked, and that, her killer is still out there. And so it just kind of tugged at home. The most minimal thing I think I could do as a cemetery is just figure out how to mark her. Because we believe that everybody should be marked, but we also understand that not everybody does. But this was actually an opportunity where, as the cemetery, we could help intervene with that.
One person who has never forgotten about Mary Ellen is Mansfield Police Detective John Arcudi. He handled hundreds, maybe thousands of cases over his long career in law enforcement. He's comfortable in retirement now, but this is one case that he can't seem to stop thinking about. When we met up with him recently near his house, I noticed he had a thick binder with him.
You've got your book with you. That's your file on Lester, right?
Yeah.
Can I ask you just why you held on to that? I mean, I can't imagine there are many cases that you kept a hold of the old files on.
I don't know. There's something about this case that affects officers when they get involved with Lester Eubanks that...
Arcudi told me there were some investigators who had worked on this case who never stopped thinking about it, and others who refused to discuss it at all. He was thinking about a deputy sheriff who worked the case. Arcudi told us, don't bother calling him.
I told you about this case having an effect on people. He doesn't even want to discuss anything about Lester Eubanks. He said, doesn't want to hear that name anymore.
Now, Arcudi is resting his hopes on Deputy U.S. Marshal David Seiler.
I mean, does it feel like there's like something is out of place and it needs to be put back in place, and that's Lester?
And it would be great if David Seiler can get him. It'd be fantastic. And if anybody can get him, David Seiler will get him.
While there have been a long series of unfortunate twists and turns in this case, the case is not without hope. True, the police lab couldn't recover Lester's DNA from the evidence left behind at the crime scene, but the Mansfield Crime Lab scientist Don Frybeck was not out of ideas.
So if we're able to build a solid family reference sample from somebody from Lester's lineage, then that might be a route.
Ever since genealogy sites were used to identify the Golden State Killer in California, authorities have been looking for ways to exploit people's interest in their own family trees and access the DNA sent to companies like Ancestry.com and 23andMe. Frybeck wondered if some descendant of Lester's could have placed his or her own DNA into a database, simply out of curiosity.
You know, if Lester's moved on with his life, maybe he has other children in other states who maybe they're looking for their father. And so they're using these type of websites to try to locate, you know, their father who they don't know. So we might end up getting a match that way.
Law enforcement is not permitted to use most of the commercial sites for investigations like this. But we were curious about that man who thought Lester was his father, the man who asked us not to use his name. Did he wonder if there were others like him, children of Lester's, looking for answers? We met up at a Cracker Barrel restaurant. He told me he wanted to find out. So out front, in two of the rocking chairs on the porch, we sat together and cracked open test kits, and he began to fill vials with swabs and saliva.
Place the bag in the tube.
When we return, would the DNA testing kits provide new clues? And the marshals learn more about that painting, the one Lester's father had arranged to be painted for a friend.
Hey everyone, it's ABC's Paula Ferris. I'm the host of Journeys of Faith. As you know all too well, we are in an election year. So on this season, we're talking to 2020 presidential candidates and other political figures about how their faith and religion influence their person and their politics.
Before you tell me about your religion, first show it to me and how you treat other people.
You can call God by many different names, but we are worshiping the same God.
So check out Journeys of Faith wherever you're listening now.
I was in a remote spot in rural Pennsylvania. All around me, vibrant green mountains. I had pulled into a parking lot with Deputy U.S. Marshal David Seiler. In front of us were low-slung cinder block buildings surrounded by a double layer of fencing, topped with razor wire. Seiler and his partner were about to enter a federal prison complex to finally get some answers about a painting.
We are in Allenwood, Pennsylvania. We are headed to Bureau of Prisons facility to interview a gentleman who has a relationship or had a relationship with Mose Eubanks, and we're hopefully we'll be able to develop some information from him.
And this is, we're going to call this guy the painter, right? This is the guy who we identified from his painting at the Banks house.
Correct. So hopefully the painter will be able to develop, or at least provide us with a little bit of information that could get us a step closer to Lester.
Seiler was now confident that it was this man, and not Lester, who was the artist behind the painting he had carried out of the home of the civil rights lawyer James Banks. The signature on the painting read, D. Hale, Working through the prison system, Seiler had identified a man named Daniel Hale, who was now an inmate at the Allenwood Minimum Security Prison in rural Pennsylvania. It turned out